So this is kind of a special gathering. The woman to my left, Nikki Wheler-Nicholson, is her grandfather founded the comic books that became DC Comics and that became the American comic book business, and discovered Superman, since she was the first person in editing and publishing to take an interest in Superman and the idea of the superhero as such. And the fellow to my right, his grandfather came to own DC Comics, or came to own those companies soon after, and was the principal owner and the head of the company when Superman was published, and was both the public face, I'd say, and the driving force of DC Comics all the way up until his death in 1965. My grandfather ran a milk truck in Oakland, California. And I think that's, we can stop there. With my ancestry. So I'm Gerard Jones. I used to write comic books, and I've written a couple books about comics, so that's why I'm here. And in fact, well, I'll pitch the Nikki Wheler-Nicholson Gerard Jones project at the end. So Nick,
yes.
Let us start with you. I think we'll sort of go back into the early years. Yes, you can get that picture. That's your granddad's Major Malcom Wheler-Nicholson. So give us just a thumbnail of how he came to create this thing called comic.
This is a photograph of my grandfather in 1948 in Sweden. My grandmother was Swedish, Ilsa. And my grandfather had a very adventuresome life. He started out in the military in the U.S. Army, the cavalry, in 1911. And he was on the Mexican border chasing Pancho Villa. Then he was commanding Troop K of the African American Buffalo Soldiers. He went to the Philippines and did some of the mop-up operations with the Muslim Moros. And then in 1917, he went to Siberia with the American Expeditionary Force as he was in military intelligence. And then after he was court-martialed for writing an open letter to President, what? Oh my God. No, my mind just went blank. Anyway, Harding, thank you. I tell this story so many times, I think I might just be in auto mode sometimes. Anyway, so it had to do with some racial injustice that he was concerned about, and the ultimate result was that he was court-martialed. He was absolved of everything but writing the letter to Harding, which is a court-martial offense. You can't do that in the military. And after that, he started writing fictional pulp stories for mostly Adventure Magazine and Argosy, and these were adventure stories. They were PG-13. He was nominated for three times for O. Henry Short Story Award, and he and my grandmother at one point were living in France in this, they had a chateau they were renting north of Paris and having a great time. He was making really good money from the pulps. And then the Depression hit and the pay went way down. And so they had to come back to the States. And he saw that, I guess he probably saw William Gaines's famous funnies on the newsstands. And that was those were reprints from the newspapers. And he had the bright idea in the middle of the Depression to start a comic book company. And with all original scripts and all original artwork. And that's how it all started.
That's good. We'll pause there. So there's one parallel lives we're talking about. Switched to a very different life, but in a way it's as representative, I think, of the early 20th century as that one. He was born, what, 1890?
Yeah, 1890.
Yeah, and your granddad was 93?
Something around, yeah, somewhere in there.
Two guys born around the same time, one in Tennessee, one in Romania.
Yeah.
Different lives collided. What can you tell us about what led to Harry Donenfeld being in a position to get himself into this comic book business?
Well, Harry had come over, I think he was about 6 years old, from Romania. His older brothers had already come to the States and settled in. And so the last of the family put him on a boat by himself at the age of 6, sent him across the Atlantic, and showed up at Ellis Island, like most of the other immigrants, and worked and lived with his brothers for the early ages. And Harry would stand on the street corner. Part of his essential sales training, I think, was that he sold lollipops and newspapers on the corner. He was one of the newsies and the news kids, and that's how he made his living. Tried to put himself through college, was sort of a Rhodes Scholar, never actually finished college. He was always a bit of an entrepreneur and had tried several different businesses, including a legendary clothing store in New Jersey with his wife Gussie that failed. And when that went under, his brothers owned a company called Donnie Press, and they were printers. And they said, okay, Harry, enough, why don't you come back in and work with us over at Donnie Press. And that was kind of how it started. From Donnie Press, he kept expanding his knowledge and base in the printing and the distribution side. Again, Harry was more of a salesman, so they would use him to do the distribution more than the production of the printing. And so eventually when he set up, I think it was National Distribution, Independent News, thank you, sorry, Independent News. What he would do is take the rights to magazines, comics, things like that, and his job was just to get it on the stand. So he would work with the publishers, take the material and get it all across the country. And he leveraged that position to eventually acquire DC Comics.
Fight!
Harry, did you notice the photo?
Oh, good God, I really do look like my dad.
Yeah. This is a wonderful photo of Harry's grandfather here and his dad, Irwin, the younger looking man on the other side with Jack Leibowitz.
Coming between them and
Sitting
over.
between them. Funny how that is. Split them right down the middle, didn't they?
I thought that was a very interesting photograph, but it's also a nice one of your grandfather and your dad. I liked it.
Oh yeah, well we used to joke, there was no question who my father was, we weren't quite sure about Mom.
So let's talk about business ethos. So let's talk about approaches to doing these things. We've got, just go back to you here, we've got this former military officer turned freelance writer who had an interest in comics. Just might mention, he had, in the 20s, Malcom Wheler-Nicholson had tried to launch a newspaper syndicate with little news articles and things, but also comic strips. And he wrote some of the comic strips. So this was a guy who was intrigued by the form already, and did a lot of sketching and fiction.
Yeah, I've been researching this for about 20 years now, and at one point, I guess it was about 10 years ago, I went to St. John's Manlius School in New York State, where he had gone to military school. It's now a co-ed boarding school type of thing. It's no longer a military school. But the woman there who was in charge of development found two of the early yearbooks from the years that he was there. And it was just amazing because there were drawings all throughout the yearbooks that he had done. And at that point, I didn't know that he drew. And after I discovered that, then later on, when I started finding out about the syndicate that he started in 1926, there were comic strips that were picturized by Malcom Wheeler-Nicholson. And they were things like the Three Musketeers, and he's noted by Robert Louis Stevenson scholars for being the first person to put Stevenson in graphic form in the newspaper and then again in the comics. So he had an early interest in this notion of graphic novels, of picturizing novels, and of comic strips. So yeah, he early on was very, very interested in it.
And do you feel Harry, what would Harry's thoughts have been about fiction or comic strips, or was he wanting to get into this stuff, or did he just walk into it as a printer by mistake?
Somewhere in between that, yeah. I was going to say, I'm going to, you know, a little bit of walking in there by mistake. I mean, he really was not an inventor or a creator. This wasn't his medium. Although he enjoyed working with the writers and the creators of this, he was a salesman. And more than anything else, they gave him something that he could champion, he could get behind, he could believe in, he knew was right, and that the sales of that object, I don't know where I'm trying to go with that. Yeah, I mean, it was...
Harry, don't you think that he also had an appreciation for a lot of the artwork, because he hired a lot of really great pulp artists? Like...
Oh, he absolutely, and he understood the value, I guess more than anything else, he really understood the value of their work. As opposed to in that time, in that era, these illustrators and artists really weren't given a value to their existence and their work. If you weren't really a fine artist, then the hell were you? And a lot of these kids and people were not allowed to be fine artists. So certainly during that era, Jewish kids could not be a fine artist. It was just not acceptable. And so he understood the value and giving them a place that they could be expressive and allow that to happen. And that was important to him. And in his pulp novels, he had fantastic artists that made these incredible covers for him. And it was a twofold process. It was an excellent form of expression and allowing these kids to be able to show themselves, Norm Saunders being one of them. Right. But it also added value to his book. These novels could sell. There was something on the cover that made you stop and look at it, and therefore you would take it apart, you know, and go through it. So it was pretty apparent to him that this was these mediums needed to be together, and DC gave him that opportunity.
So the major sets up shop.
Yes.
This freelancer gets some office space and some support from what seemed apparently the McClure's family. He basically on his own, sets up his little folding table or whatever he's got. And how did he run his business? Give us a sense of what his approach to the publishing business was.
Well, the pulps were very much a part of his life, because he wrote for some of the top pulps of the time. He knew the publishers. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Bill Barnes, but that was a big pulp hero, and he was the person who created that under a house name. And there were other house names in the pulps that he worked with the publisher. So he's very familiar with the publishing business and how it operated. The pulp business was put together in a way, the contracts were sometimes just signed on the backs of checks. And there were things like, it was sort of a known understanding that in the pulp business, you would make a contract for first North American serial rights. So the publisher got the first North American serial rights, and then after that, the rights reverted back to you. And this is how Jerry Siegel understood the situation, because that was the contract he had with the major. So his assumption was that a contract would be first North American serial rights, and then it comes back to you. My grandfather was one of those people who did business with a handshake. He was old-fashioned in that way. His word was his honor. At one point, one of the young writers complained that his contracts were awful because they said something like, if I make money, you make money. If I don't make money, you don't make money. And I read that the guy was complaining about it years later, and I read it and I thought, well, that's a lot better than selling it for $140. So he was very old-fashioned in that sense and not quite prepared for what came down the pike. He was mostly interested in the creative side of it.
So we'll switch again. You hit a couple things. One is how did Harry Donenfeld become involved with this automobile company? What was that? And then if you want to talk about Harry's accountant and business partner and how that shaped. Basically, what was the approach of the Donenfeld family to this kind of publishing?
Well, his whole business acumen was about family. So everything he did in a family-oriented way. He was more, again, salesman-oriented. When the potential came up for DC Comics, he didn't have the money or the ability to acquire the company. And he had to go into partnership with Paul Sambliner, his attorney, and Jack Leibowitz, his accountant. That guy, up there. And in doing so, I guess you could say he made the deal with the devil and would eventually pay the price for that down the road. By bringing Jack onto the team, he brought the businessman and the true business side of comics and the industry, and the man who would eventually shape the way this whole place took effect. And it wasn't actually Harry. Harry was busy on the road running around doing sales, which is what he was supposed to do. But Mr. Leibowitz over there is the one who did most of the negotiations and ultimately these deals. They come from the streets of New York and Brooklyn in the 20s, and their friends had very Italian-sounding names. So
Luciano?
Luciano, Costello.
Costello, Meyer, Lansky, things like that. And yes, Frank was Harry's dear and best friend most of his life, Frank Costello. So their approach was definitely family-oriented. And a little more aggressive, I think, than most people were expecting in that time and era.
And completely foreign to my grandfather.
So it gets really convoluted when you're talking about the whole shebang, but if you could give us, kind of briefly, because we're actually, Nikki and I are going to have a panel right after this in a different room talking about the major entirely. So we're going to try to, there's a lot of room to amplify. But do you want to really briefly give us a sense of how the company ceased to be Nicholson Publications?
It is very convoluted and complicated.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's easier when you're not the person in the middle of all the research. Yeah, the short version. Wheler-Nicholson had engaged Donny Press as his cover printer, and he lost his distribution. He was with what was the Science McCall Syndicate, which was one of the sort of big old respectable distribution companies. And because I think this stuff was new and it wasn't making a lot of money, and I think the big distributor kicked him out, basically let him go. We don't know exactly, but he discovered that Donny Press / Independent News distributed, and so there's a point where Harry Donenfeld becomes the printer and distributor for Wheler-Nicholson.
Not good.
Yeah, you're kind of squeezed at that point.
Sorry, that bill has been more than 30 days.
And anyone can jump in to correct, but there's there's a lot of fuzziness around why the major was not paying his bills and whether or not Leibowitz was doing something with the ledgers or whatever, we're not sure, but the bottom line is that the major did keep running into the red, and there is a law, or was a law at that time in New York, that if 3 people are owed money by the same debtor, they could force a bankruptcy. So Harry or Jack or somebody orchestrated with the engraver and the printer and took it to court and said, this Wheeler-Nicholson guy owes all of us money, he's not paying, and at that point it becomes a court action, and the court, after a long struggle, in which Wheeler-Nicholson really did fight, the major fought to keep it. Some of the legend out there is he just was blindsided and walked away dazed, but no,
Not
he
true.
fought hard.
Not true.
But he lost the company. Yeah, the company was declared bankrupt, and the properties, the titles were sold in bankruptcy court, and Jack Leibowitz was there when the sale opened. with
The only one in the room. Hi, me, thank you.
But one point I want to make that a lot of fans get confused about is that there were 2 companies. There was my grandfather's publishing company called, it went through a number of names, but at that point it was called Nicholson Publishing, Inc. And that company owned all the titles, Adventure, all those titles. There were 10 titles. And then my grandfather was in a second company with Jack Leibowitz called Detective Comics. It was not Detective Comics that was forced into bankruptcy. It was Nicholson Publishing, Inc. And the devil is in the details. And that's what people don't understand. He still was a partner in DC Comics when they forced him into bankruptcy. So that forcing him into bankruptcy was the way that got him out of DC Comics.
There's still some digging to do on what exactly induced him to sell his half of DC to Leibowitz, but whatever.
It was because it was Leibowitz.
Yeah, there was a lot of confusion there. And so that's the gist of it, basically. And I wanted to, I think both Harry and Jack have histories of taking over other people's companies.
Oh, absolutely. There's no, I'm not here to clear his name or make apologies for him. He was a businessman in the 30s, and he did what he did, and he had friends that would help him, certainly. I don't think he is quite the character most of history has made him out to be, but he was there. So part of his culpability is that in the end he didn't stop anything.
And